A sacred mountain, flames of fire, wood that doesn't burn, a divine voice, the crossroads of cultures and religions and language inside the heart and memory and life of a lonely man, and the beginning of something still talked about after more than 3,000 years.
I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom.
Well, this is another one of those episodes where life happens, and I've been sick for a number of days, and I've had a wonderful, chaotic time with a family staycation here at our house, and there may be all sorts of background noise. I don't know. I'm a little bit behind on things. I also am not in my normal recording setup, so the sound is going to be different. The sound of my voice is different because of being sick, but life happens. But here we are, continuing with the Moses material. And I've been sharing about my friend Moses, who, according to tradition, is about 80 years old as we open this episode, looking into Exodus chapter 3 a little further. He has spent, according to tradition, 40 years in Egypt. He's part Hebrew and part Egyptian. He was raised for much of his first 40 years within the very center of a major world power, Egypt, and raised in Pharaoh's household. He then spent his next 40 years in Midian, maybe 300 miles away from Egypt, and lived as a Midianite, absorbing their language and culture and religion and way of life. In terms of social setting, he's about as far away from his life in Egypt as it is possible for him to be. Among the Midianites, he lived a quiet life as a shepherd and family man among a relatively insignificant people. He is married, has 2 sons. One he named Gershom, which means stranger there, or sojourner, a foreigner, a refugee. A later passage in Exodus tells us that the other son is named Eliezer, meaning, my God helped. And I think the names he chose for his sons provide us with a window into the emotional texture of Moses' life during this period. Gershom expresses his experiences as a stranger, a refugee, at risk, alone, in unfamiliar territory, isolated, far from the family of his birth, estranged and hated by a man who had helped raise him, but then wanted him killed. Eliezer expresses his experience that amidst all of that, there has been divine help, the presence of God protecting and leading him, even rescue. Moses seems to have come to believe that in the midst of the liminal vulnerability of existence in a brutal and broken world where terrible things happen and evil people rise to power, there's also light, grace, mercy, mercy, and deliverance. Now, in Hebrew, the name Eliezer is a contraction of a word for God and a word for help, so it means God helped me. But the word Moses uses for God is El, a word common in the wider religious context of the ancient Near East and not a specifically Jewish or Israelite term for God. His understanding of who this God is will change very soon as we move into the events of the burning bush found here in Exodus chapter 3. And by the way, now I'm going to read my own rendering of verses 1 through 6 of Exodus 3, which I have translated from the Hebrew. I am transliterating, however, the words that are used here for God, and we'll come back to the reasons for that and the meaning of those words a bit later. But here's the passage. Now Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock deep into the wilderness and came to a mountain of Elohim known as Horeb, meaning wasteland. An angel of Yahweh was visible to Moses within flames of fire in a thorn bush, and as he looked, he noticed that the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not devoured in the flames. Moses thought to himself, well, this is strange. Why isn't the bush being burned up by the flame? I need to get closer and have a better look. When Yahweh saw that he stepped aside to look, Elohim called to him from inside of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Yes, it's me. And then he said, Do not come any closer. Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, the Elohim of Jacob. And then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim. Now, I want to go back over all of that verse by verse. So, verse 1. Now Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock deep into the wilderness and came to a mountain of Elohim known as Horeb, meaning wasteland. First, this word priest, Kohen in Hebrew. The text is using the same word that's used for the Israelite priesthood later. I mention this because this is one of several examples of the way that this text is what I call interreligious or interspiritual. The Midianites, which Jethro is part of, had a religion and a priesthood. And as did, of course, the Israelites later in the wilderness under Moses' leadership, as did all the peoples of the region, and it's logical to assume that the Israelite ceremonies and rituals and sacred personnel, which we will discover later in Exodus, were influenced by all of this wider context. With Jethro, the text not only uses the word for priest that is used for the Israelite priests, but also recognizes Jethro's priesthood functionally. Later in Exodus 18, after the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, Jethro and Moses will meet in the wilderness, where Jethro is again called a priest, and we're told there that Jethro, upon hearing of the events of the Exodus, took a sacrifice to offer to God, and that Moses and Aaron and other elders joined. In that setting, Jethro is the active subject. He's the one leading the ceremony. And the verb used to take the sacrifice to God is the same that is used, for example, when Abraham, back in Genesis, took a sacrifice to God, chapter 15 of Genesis. So Jethro, as a priest in the Midianite religion, is leading the sacrificial ceremony, which Moses and others take part in, that celebrates what God has done in delivering Israel from Egypt. There's something about the way these two religious worlds meet in that ceremony that is mutual in a very real and tangible sense. And that's why I call it an interspiritual or interreligious ceremony in which the either or, which is usually assumed in Western religious conversations, talking about whether one religion is right or not, that either or doesn't exist here. There's no question of which religion is right. It is both and. For those of you who've been following the episodes, you might recall my little parable of aliens trying to describe a truck on planet Earth, which they could only experience by touch. They touched different portions and described things differently as a result, but it was the same truck they experienced. That was the point of that parable. Well, here in the ceremony of Exodus 18, it was as if two of the aliens got together and combined their different experiences of the truck so that they could each experience what the other had. Not one at a time, but together. All right, back to Exodus 3 and the mountain where Moses saw this bush and fire. The mountain is called Horeb, and it's from a word meaning wasteland or desolation or wilderness, so nothing particularly important about the name necessarily. But we're also told that this was deep in the wilderness and that Horeb is what the text says, a mountain of Elohim. Now, first note that it is a mountain, not the mountain of Elohim. So there could be many mountains of God at this point in the story. Of course, later, this mountain does become very important and singular, and it becomes the mountain for Israel, known as Sinai. But here, it's known as a sacred place, not only in some exclusive sense, like for Israel. It's not sacred to just one people or one religion. It is a mountain of Elohim, a divine figure in the wider ancient Near East, or at least a term used for divine figures in the ancient Near East. Discussion of the mountain brings us to one of the ways the text refers to God. We've already said it, the word Elohim. And that word is a plural for El, which we've mentioned above, a common reference for God in ancient Near Eastern cultures and their religions. Elohim is the plural, and as such it was used to refer to angels in some cases, even to human leaders as well, as a sort of superlative, like in the UK where people of a certain status might be called lords, or your lord, my lord. A primary usage of Elohim is in reference to the pantheon of deities, the gods, literally plural. All of those uses of a plural of El make sense because they refer to plural classes of beings. However, Elohim could also be used with the definite article to mean the supreme God in the singular. And in that case, though it may be grammatically a plural noun, it is functionally singular. And in fact, there's cases where the plural noun, Elohim, gods, is used with a singular verb. And to get a sense of the feel of that, I want to consider a sentence that says, for example, Elohim is watching. Sounds right, doesn't it, in English? But since Elohim is actually plural grammatically, the phrase in English actually should be Elohim are watching, gods are watching. So now let's replace Elohim with the right plural pronoun, they. But they are watching, or they is watching. Keep that verb in the singular, which is what the text would do if it was referring to Elohim as a singular God, but using the plural noun, and the sentence becomes they is watching. And that's how it would sound to say Elohim is watching. And yet that would be the correct translation when it's referring to the singular God. Of course, there's more than grammar going on here. At this point in the text, a person of the day and age of Moses would probably have simply understood a mountain of Elohim to mean that this is a sacred mountain in the broadest sense. As I've said above, it's a place of spiritual presence, and it could be that for people of all sorts of cultural and religious backgrounds. It's a thin place, not belonging to any particular religion. Now the text continues, and we learn that in this thin place, an angel of Yahweh was visible to Moses within flames of fire in a thorn bush. And as he looked, he noticed that the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not devoured in the flames. An angel of Yahweh. The narrator is speaking in what we would call third-person omniscient voice. The narrator knows things the characters in the story don't know, or don't know yet, and they tell us what they know, so now we know. We're brought in to the look behind the scenes, as it were. But at this stage, Moses doesn't know what we know. He doesn't know this is an angel of Yahweh. But what should we understand that phrase, angel of Yahweh, to mean? Starting with angel. Most often, most literally, that word used on its own simply means a messenger. Any sort of messenger, not only a supranatural being or entity. It could be a human messenger, somebody sent from a king, for example. However, in the Hebrew sacred text, the phrase angel of Yahweh, or of the Lord, as it's normally translated in English, is also a way of speaking somewhat indirectly about God. The angel of the Lord is often a manifestation of God in the sacred texts of the Hebrew Scriptures. So, we know from the narrator that this manifestation of the divine being, known throughout the region as El and Elohim, is Yahweh. And we'll come back to who that is and what that word means later. Of course, again, Moses doesn't know any of this, not yet. As of yet, he doesn't even know that this is even a divine encounter. Let's keep that in mind. All he knows is that there are flames of fire in a bush that isn't burning up. He doesn't know there's a divine being of some sort in the middle of all of that. What he does know is this bush is burning and not being consumed. And that's why the text says, as he looked, he noticed that the bush was burning with fire and not devoured in the flame. So his response to that is not, oh, this is God. It's this. It's curiosity. Verse 3 picks up and says, Moses said to himself, this is strange. Why isn't that bush being burned up by the flame? I need to get closer and have a better look. And then verse 4. When Yahweh saw that he, Moses, stepped aside to look, Elohim called to him from inside of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Yes, it's me. Now, when Yahweh, and again, only we know that this is Yahweh still at this point. All Moses knows now is he's hearing some kind of voice, and it's got to begin dawning on him that something is happening here that is supranatural. But when Yahweh, we're told, sees Moses has turned aside, then Yahweh speaks, or Elohim speaks. We'll come back to the fact that those two terms are used here interchangeably a little bit later. But that phrase has always made me wonder. That phrase that says that God spoke after seeing that Moses had turned aside, that's always made me wonder, what if Moses didn't turn aside? What would have happened? We can't say from the text, of course, but it seems like there's a hint that perhaps God wouldn't have spoken if Moses had simply passed by. He waited to see if Moses would turn aside before speaking. So it makes me wonder how many quote-unquote burning bushes I may have missed in my life because I just didn't take the time or exercise the curiosity to turn aside and look and ask, what's happening here? Now, in this text, as I said, Yahweh and Elohim are used interchangeably. There is a specific, unique name, Yahweh, seen in Judaism and Christianity as the particular sacred name of the one true God, the God of gods, we could say. And that particular unique name or being with that name is being presented as the same being as Elohim, which we described earlier, the word for the divine being used throughout the region by many peoples and their various cultures and religions. In effect, the text is saying their Elohim is Yahweh, and Yahweh is their Elohim. Now, this sort of viewpoint is not always what people assume when they read the books of Moses or the so-called Old Testament. The most common assumption is that these texts are religiously and theologically exclusive, telling the true story of the one true religion and the one true God to the exclusion of all others, rather than what I think is actually happening here. There is a true God, according to Moses and the books of Moses, but that one God is meeting people and leading people and revealing themselves within the broad religious context of the ancient Near East. It is the God of all those peoples, regardless of the names being used. We already observed that God met and talked with Abraham, but also did so with Pharaoh back in Genesis. In fact, it seemed like Pharaoh was more responsive to God than Abraham was at that point. Now, that's just one example. The Bible presents a much more universalist picture of the divine than most typically assume. Back to the text. Once God has Moses' attention, then verse 5 and 6, and I'll combine them here. He said, "Don't come any closer. Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. I'm the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob." Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim. Now, Moses is discovering what the narrator has informed you and I about all along. Now Moses is getting it. This is more than a strange phenomenon. This is a divine encounter. And there's a lot happening in these two condensed verses. First, God says, don't come any closer. There's a consistent theme in the books of Moses that while God may be active in the affairs of humans and of the world and can be described as near and even compassionate, there is at the same time a distance, an otherness in the way the divine is seen and experienced. And when we come back to talk about the questions that I posed to the Buddha and John, what is real, for example, this is an aspect of the response that Moses and the books of Moses would bring to that question. And then there's the phrase, remove your sandals, for this is holy ground. Now, I read texts from the point of view of an artist, and when I read and intuit and imagine this scene as an artist, and read it as I would a work of art, then the reference to sandals and ground suggests to me something like this. Take off the shoes that you have walked in that got you here. Whatever worked to get you this far, however much dust of the road of life is stuck to all that it took to walk that road, all that has to come off now. Why? Because this is holy or sacred ground. And the term for ground here is the same as in Genesis 2, where we're told that humanity was crafted from the ground. The ground is what we're made from. It's literally the soil of our humanity. The text urges Moses, and I think therefore indirectly us, to get barefoot, with nothing between ourselves and our deepest and oldest human origins. No sandals, no separation from the ground, no separation from who we really are and our true origins. Just the skin of our bare feet directly touching bare ground. And what does it mean to say that this is holy ground? The Hebrew word for holy or sacred here is built around 3 consonants. All Semitic languages really are built around consonants, and in this case it's in English Q, D, and S, or Quds. It's a term common in the family of Semitic languages in the ancient Near East, ancient Hebrew and Phoenician and Arab and Akkadian and Canaanite languages. The root meaning is easy enough. It's special, separated, set apart for some special purpose. And that can be used to refer to a place, like a sanctuary or a temple, or in this case, a location out in the wilderness, a mountain, an object, or a person. And here I'm going to repeat some points that I made above. At this point, it is clear to Moses that this is more than a strange phenomenon. This is a divine encounter. And that makes this somehow holy. And the entire event is saturated with multiple streams of cultural and religious influence. It's an interreligious event from beginning to end. And again, Moses himself, as we have seen, is a hybrid person, culturally and religiously, Egyptian, Hebrew, Midianite. The fact that this encounter with God takes place within that broader interreligious, interspiritual context of the ancient Near East brings us back to the vocabulary used for God in this passage. And as already mentioned, there's 2 terms in the scene, Elohim and Yahweh. Now, I don't need to repeat everything already said about Elohim. It's a common divine term within the larger religious world of the ancient Near East. The term Yahweh, however, deserves a little more attention. It's possible that the origins of the term may have developed as a way to speak originally of an ancient Semitic deity that then became the national god of Israel, and a god that Israel came to know of as not just their national, local, you could say, cultural god, but the god of all the gods. It could have begun that way, and if so, that could have happened as early as the 12th century before the Christian era, or the Common Era, and perhaps even earlier. Israelite religion was birthed within the soil of a generally polytheistic religious set of practices, common to the historical period of the time and the geographic location in which Israel came to be a people throughout this entire broad region. And she shared, as we've seen, much of the vocabulary used in Canaan and Canaanite religion for God and the gods, including, as we've seen, El, and the vocabulary and ideas of the wider ancient Near East. But at some point, Yahweh became the particular name, the particular reference point for Israel for the God of all gods. So that although one could address Yahweh using a variety of different names, usually descriptive of some function or action of God, and while Israelite religion could see that the actions of other gods were in some cases actually the actions and work of Yahweh, the central figure behind and in all of it was this God, whose unique name was Yahweh, God of all people, God of all cultures, God of all religions, God of all places, God of all the gods. It's possible that devotion to Yahweh began as a functional or relational monotheism, Something like, Yahweh is our God, exclusively, monogamously, you could say. And in fact, that marriage context becomes a key metaphor for the relationship between Israel and God. Yahweh is our only God, but there's others out there. It may have begun that way and then developed into what some call pure monotheism. There really is only one supreme God. However, it's also possible that monotheism as we understand it was practiced much earlier than all of that. There are some theories that say that was the original and polytheism came later. Either way, the fact is that at some point Yahweh became understood to be the deity who created everything, including other deities, and as such became the deity worthy of exclusive worship and devotion, even though that exclusive devotion to Yahweh as a being was an imperfectly practiced reality throughout Israel's history, as any reading of the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures will attest. The history, the prophets, the Psalms, all of it. All right, so Yahweh. What's in a name? I've sort of skimmed over maybe the most important aspect that the discussion of Yahweh might have to offer us. I've been using it like a personal name in the way that my name is Kevin. But before it was a name, it was a word, which raises the question, what does that word mean, or what does it come from? And the evidence suggests that the name in various forms seems to be evident as early as before the year 1000 before the Common Era, roughly the period during which the events of the book of Exodus took place. And it seems to have been present in various forms among many different peoples, including possibly in Egypt and in the region where the Midianites lived. There are almost as many theories as to what it may have originally meant and what divine qualities it may have been used to signify, as there are scholars who hold those theories. What interests me for our purposes in the podcast, however, is not so much the archaeological or linguistic data, as important as that is, but the way the term Yahweh functions in this story. In Moses' experience of the divine and in his subsequent understanding of who Yahweh is and what Yahweh is like and what he experienced or came to understand that Yahweh said to him in that moment. The meaning given in the narrative is connected to the Hebrew verb to be, which in English would be, be or is. As a result, most English versions render Exodus 3, verse 14, which comes a little later and we'll look more deeply at it, I am who I am, or sometimes I will be who I will be. There's a lot of significance of this for the way that Exodus would answer the question that I discussed with John and Buddha in several earlier episodes. What is real? This is getting to the heart of the way the books of Moses would answer that. If God is what is really real, then who is that? And how do different ideas of God and experiences of God factor into understanding who God is, how God appears, speaks, acts? And a central question related to it all is, how does this Yahweh relate to Elohim and in turn to other divinities? However, there is a lot more to all of this conversation, including much more about Yahweh, the being Yahweh and the word Yahweh, and it's going to require more space than I've left myself in this episode. So now what? By which I mean, now what in the story, and now what in the podcast? There is more that the passage has to say about the encounter itself. The conversation between Yahweh and Moses has barely begun. And that conversation will also reveal that there will be a lot more to the whole longer story of the book of Exodus and the rest of the books of Moses, because this experience between Moses and the divine with this bush that isn't consumed is leading up to something. It's not an end in and of itself. And here's a glimpse of what that is, which we will start to come back to in the next episode. The passage continues by saying that Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good, spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." The entire event of Exodus 3 has a lot to offer in response to the questions I posed to Buddha and John when I brought them together. I've mentioned that several times. So, what is real? What went wrong? How to fix it? And we're going to dig deeper into all of that as we proceed. In just this portion of the chapter I just read, for example, packed into all of that, there's a lot more about the way that the books of Moses present the divine nature here. Very anthropomorphically, very human-like. In other words, some of the answers to what is real. God's apparent delays in taking action against oppression, which is beginning to raise ingredients about the what went wrong part of the conversation. And the place of human agency in carrying out God's purposes, which begins to look at the way that the books of Moses address answers to the question how to fix it. These verses also take us back to the question of a promised land, something very much in the news in our time and era these days, something that we encountered also in a survey of Genesis and the story of Abraham in prior chapters or prior episodes. And all of that we will get back to next time.